For free speech, free assembly, a free press, freedom of religion.
Welcome to Washington. Thank you for joining us for this special two-part conversation looking at the future of democracy at home and abroad. 2021 was a divisive year here in America, starting with the insurrection at the Capitol in January. Abroad, summary for me was the Atlantic Monthly's cover story this month that showed a line of Chinese, Russian, Turkish, and other leaders striding forward, and the headline was, "The bad guys are winning." Last week, President Biden convened a virtual summit to rally support around the ideals of democracy, urging like-minded countries to support one another, protect human rights, and the right to a free press. We're going to talk about all those issues this morning with an extraordinary lineup of guests. My first guest today is Isobel Coleman, who's Deputy Administrator for Policy and Programming at USAID, which is the agency that reaches out to other countries on all sorts of subjects, including democracy. Isobel, welcome to Washington Post Live.
Thanks for having me.
So let's start with last week's Summit for Democracy. I want to ask you just the basic question. What was the message, especially for the two big countries that weren't invited, Russia and China?
Well, I think you in your intro you captured part of the message. You know that there's a very strong narrative that democracy is losing, and I think that the message of this summit is actually not true. There is a group of countries around the world, many of whom are very vibrant democracies, who care deeply about democracy, who are willing to invest in democracy, who are willing to champion democracy in their own countries. And globally. And while we have seen democratic backsliding, of course, around the world, I think this is the 15th straight year now that Freedom House, as it measures democratic progress or backsliding, has cataloged democratic backsliding in the world. So it's a real stamp, a real effort to say, you know, we're not going to just recede into history here. Democracy needs to be invested in. It needs to be championed, and the United States is gonna help lead on that effort with some humility, recognizing that we have to invest in our own democracy at home too.
Let's focus, Isobel, on the point you made at the end of your comment. I often find when I'm talking with officials from foreign governments that they ask, looking at our election experience, at what happened January 6th, at the turmoil in our country over the last few years, whether we're really a reliable partner, whether the commitments that are made by one administration will be swept away by another, what our staying power is as an advocate for democracy and human rights. I'm sure you get a similar set of questions as you travel. How do you answer them?
Well, democracy is messy. It's messy here at home in the United States. It's messy in many different places. But I think that while you definitely see a back and forth, a give and take in this country, at the end of the day, there's a very strong commitment, a bipartisan commitment to human rights and rule of law. And even though we hear a lot of noise around it, and we have our own issues at home, we are, I think, as a country committed in upholding core democratic values and investing in them here and globally. So it's not straight line. We recognize that. We recognize that a lot of countries, when they look at us, it's a little bit hard to figure out sometimes what's actually going on, but I think the very strong through line through administrations on both sides is a deep commitment to the values of democracy.
And just to ask the question and get your response directly, do you think it's important that there be bipartisan support from both parties in Congress for things like President Biden's Summit for Democracies?
Well, there has been bipartisan support. I see bipartisan support on an anti-corruption agenda, bipartisan support on human rights, clear bipartisan support for the work that USAID does around the world in promoting democracy and rule of law and good governance and anti-corruption work. I speak to lawmakers on both sides of the aisle, and many of them are on both sides are very passionate about these values and this agenda.
We had an interesting event yesterday. Presidents Xi of China and Putin of Russia held their own virtual summit. I don't know what we'd call this. I'll leave you if you've got a name for what to call their summit. I'd like to hear it. But what did you make of that? It obviously seemed to be a response. What's their counter message as President Biden talks about the need to champion democracy?
Well, they referred to our summit as a so-called democracy summit. I think I can throw that back at their so-called summit. It's interesting. We heard a lot of noise from both Russia and China about this democracy summit in a way that makes me think it caught their attention at a minimum, if not got under their skin in various ways. And their response was not to say, hey, we are authoritarian regimes and we're doing great. Instead, they both said, hey, we're democracies ourselves. So they must see some value in calling themselves democracies, even though I don't believe that they are. The fact is that I think that getting a group of countries together to commit to their own democratic ideals and journey and values, I think is a very important step. And it certainly caught the attention of Russia and China enough that they felt compelled to have their own event.
Certainly the fact that Taiwan, not a country, but certainly a democracy, not a nation independent, but certainly a democracy. The fact that Taiwan was invited got China's attention. Speak a little bit about the decision to do that and why you thought that was right.
Well, I think there's no doubt that Taiwan represents vibrant democracy. It's got all of the elements that we're looking for in countries to really be champions of a wide range of values on the democracy front. And so it was, I think, logical for Taiwan to be there. It wasn't meant to be a particular statement about anything other than about democracy.
Just a moderator's intervention, having traveled to Taiwan, there is no doubting the intensity of democratic spirit among people living in Taiwan. Let me ask you a question that I think many of our viewers would be curious about. Does USAID do pro-democracy programming in China, in Russia? Is that part of your mandate?
USAID has long supported democracy reformers who work, many of them outside of Russia. We used to have programming in Russia and have our space for doing that has been constrained more and more. And so some of that support goes to very courageous and brave human rights and democracy reformers outside the country. I'm sure that your subsequent speaker, Mike McFaul, can speak a lot more about that. But we have over the years invested quite a bit in trying to help elements of civil society have a footing in these, certainly in Russia, and to some extent less so today in China. In China, the work is again has to the extent that particularly with some of the Uyghur activists has been outside of China.
And Isobel, more broadly, what role do you see democracy promotion, human rights advocacy playing in USAID grant making around the world? Let's leave Russia and China out of it now. How big a priority is that? How do you go about trying to strengthen those forces?
Well, it's been a big priority for decades at USAID. I think we recognize that economic development really can't fully take root if you don't have countries that are abiding by the rule of law and human rights, and that having a democratic ecosystem is going to be much more sustainable over the long term for all of the economic development work that we promote. So, and moreover, democracy elements, the freedom of the press and strong institutions and anti-corruption measures and rule of law and good governance, all of these things are values in and of themselves. So USAID has invested around the world in helping civil society promote all of these elements in their own countries. So it has long been important and it will continue to be important. And we are ramping up our efforts in a couple of areas to meet the president's call on this initiative to really restore and replenish democracy globally.
Let me ask you a question, Isobel, that I hear sometimes when I travel abroad. People will say to me sometimes, you Americans put so much stress on elections. You want us to have elections, but you don't put as much stress on the rule of law. I think of Iraq, a country that has regular elections, but is so corrupt that the average Iraqi citizen is just enraged at the way governance works in that country. Do you think sometimes we have the balance a little bit out of whack, that we should put more focus on rule of law and a little bit less on whether you had nominal balloting?
Well, it's a good question. I think that rule of law is absolutely critical, and anti-corruption work, as the president has noted and really elevated in this administration, is also incredibly important. And you've cite the example of Iraq, but last year more than half the people who participated in demonstrations around the world were out marching in the streets, some taking personal risk to do so, on a platform of trying to combat corruption in their countries, really calling it out. There's tremendous frustration around the world on corruption, and that's why President Biden has issued the first presidential memorandum on anti-corruption, calling it a national security issue, because I think there's a clear recognition that anti-corruption efforts are critical to promoting democracy, and people's frustration about corruption is bubbling over around the world. We see it, and so providing people with tools to be able to combat corruption in their own countries. I mean, that's something that USAID has long done, and we're stepping up our efforts. One of the things that I'm very proud of here that we're doing, and I think has tremendous potential, is the anti-defamation work, that the Anti-Defamation Fund that we have launched to help crusaders on the corruption front around the world. Many of them are journalists who are exposing corruption, who are writing about it and taking enormous personal risk to do so. The fund has started to with the intent of trying to help them fight back against defamation suits that come their way. Elites in their countries will undermine them, discredit them, smear them, and take them to court and wrap them up in all sorts of suits that they really are not so well positioned to defend against. So this fund is is there to support and bolster their efforts, because the work that they're doing to expose corruption is so important.
It's well said, and it's a welcome program. I want to ask you about Afghanistan, a country that America knows too well, but also too little. Our troops have left Afghanistan, obviously, but from everything we read, that country is veering toward starvation and state collapse this winter. And I want to ask you, as one of the top officials of our USAID effort, what the United States can do to help sustain basic economic activity in life in what promises to be an absolutely catastrophic winter for that country.
Yeah, it's something, thank you, David, for the question. It's something that I've been spending a lot of time on here since I arrived. Afghanistan is facing a tremendous humanitarian crisis, and the U.S. government is fully recognizes that and cognizant of that. We at USAID have committed nearly $500 million already this year in humanitarian assistance, and through our partner, the World Food Program, have reached more than 5 million people in Afghanistan with food assistance, with more on the way. We recognize that the winter months are long and cold and are the most fragile point for people in terms of food security. So we are stepping up our efforts there. And there are numerous efforts underway too, not just the United States, but this weekend there's a conference in Islamabad looking at the humanitarian situation in Afghanistan. There are the multilateral development banks are providing. The World Bank just released some funds for Afghanistan, almost $300 million, some for UNICEF, some for the World Food Program again. So really trying to pull a full court press together to mitigate the very dire circumstances that you've just described.
From what Afghan friends tell me, the heart of the problem right now is that their financial system simply doesn't operate because of U.S. sanctions. Primarily, the central bank is inoperative. To put you on the spot, what would be your personal recommendation as you meet in interagency gatherings about whether Treasury should move to make it easier for banks to function, cash to flow in that economy?
Well, just to say that the sanctions are only a part of it. There's a lot of capital flight from Afghanistan because people are very nervous about the future of the country. There's a liquidity crisis. People, again, nervous about what's to come, are hoarding cash, keeping it under their beds, under their mattresses. And there's also a physical cash issue. The government doesn't print its own currency, and there's been a breakdown in just the amount of currency circulating in the economy. So there are a number of factors here. I do think that a more forward-leaning posture by the United States is something that's going to be necessary, I think, to help the Afghan people who we care deeply about, and finding ways to do that doesn't go through the government is under active discussion.
Thanks for that direct answer, and we'll be watching over the next week, hoping that there's action taken by Treasury. Ask about a neighboring country that was invited to the Summit for Democracies, and that's Pakistan. The State Department has called out Pakistan for its history, sadly, of what are called, in legal terms, extrajudicial killings, among other human rights violations in that country. Were you comfortable with the invitation of Pakistan, and what should the United States do to help this often troubled ally do better without seeming to be dictating policy to them?
Well, David, I think you probably know that developing the invitation list for a summit like this is as much art as it is science. And there are a number of different factors that go into it. We did try to rely on some independent indices of democracy and rule of law and good governance and various factors in making the selection of the countries to invite. But at the end of the day, there were other factors that went into it too, including whether an invitation to one country might bolster their brave democratic reformers and nudge them along a path, whether an invitation would perhaps elicit from countries a commitment to step up and participate actively in this call to action over the coming year to realize some of the initiatives that were discussed at the summit and the commitments that were made. And Pakistan was invited and declined not to come. And I think that says as much as Pakistan wants it to say about its own decision on where it stands on the democracy front.
President Biden at the Democracy Summit said, among other things, we've got to prove that democracy works. It was an old-fashioned appeal to the world. A rejoinder might be, why can't the United States live with countries where they are? Why are we such proselytizers? Is there too much moralism sometimes in our foreign policy? As you know, this is a debate that goes back to the beginning of our republic. What would be your answer, Isobel, to people who say we ought to just kind of back off and stop preaching to people and learn to get along with countries where they are?
Yeah, I mean, there's always been moralism in our foreign policy. I readily acknowledge that, but I would also say that when countries are more democratic, they're better off in so many ways that redound to our advantage too. Democracies are more stable over the long term. People have higher health and education outcomes generally. This idea of making democracy deliver for people is critically important, but I think also acknowledging that democracies do deliver for people. There's a number of studies that look at over the long term that democracies do better economically in delivering for people on a whole variety of fronts, and not just on the economic fronts, but on health and education and all of these related factors. And that democracy in and of itself is a value, that people value freedom and freedom of association and rule of law and protection of human rights. So I think that it's not simply moralizing, but it's something that as President Biden has said, it's one of the great challenges of our time is to acknowledge that democracy is a good in and of itself, that it does deliver for people, and that it needs to be nurtured and invested in, that we can't just take it for granted because we have experienced democratic backsliding. And 75% of the world's population this year lives in places where democracy has declined. And there are also studies that show that it's a slippery slope. Authoritarian leads to autocracies, and we don't want the world to slide down that path. We want people to recognize the value of it and to stand up and to fight for it in their own countries, including in our country.
So good answer. Thank you for that. I want to ask you a last quick question. We have only a minute left, and it goes to what you just said. There are a growing number of countries and people living in them who are living under less democratic conditions than before. And I just want to ask you briefly, what's going on? Why are we seeing this reversal in our time? Can you identify a fundamental reason for that?
The reversal has been going on for a long time, but I think it has been sped up in some respects by technology. When the internet came on the scene, and we all thought it would be this great tool for civil society and democracy and the good guys, but bad guys have figured out how to use the internet and the tools of social media today to spread disinformation, and to be very divisive. And I think that's taking an enormous toll. And so part of this democracy renewal initiative is to focus on technology and on advancing technologies that can actually help democracies move forward in a positive way, and realize the challenge head on, because it's a very significant challenge.
Again, well said. I want to thank Isobel Coleman, who's the Deputy Administrator of USAID, for joining us for a fascinating discussion. We'll be back in a few minutes with my next guest, former Ambassador to Russia Mike McFaul, and former Director of CISA at the Department of Homeland Security, Chris Krebs. So stay with us. We'll talk to you soon.
His promotion of democracy contributed to unexpected quick successes as the Berlin Wall fell. And we were entering into a world where over a 20-year period, we saw a surge in the number of democracies in the world. There is a backlash fed by the inequalities driven by the financial crisis, by untended to issues of racism and inequity in our societies. We have to make the case of the importance of democracy to people, their families, their communities, their nation, as the best way of protecting their freedoms and protecting their futures. We are in a winter of our democracies at the moment, but I have very little doubt that there is a summer ahead of us.
Hello, I'm Elise Labott of American University, and today we're talking about threats to democracy posed by the COVID pandemic. The global public health crisis we're facing has exacerbated not just an economic crisis, but has also fueled a sense of injustice and taxed shaky political systems. And to talk about the role of philanthropy in safeguarding democracy in the age of COVID, I'm joined by Mark Malloch-Brown, president of the Open Society Foundations. Mark, great to see you again.
Thanks, Elise. Pleasure to be here.
So we've been talking a lot about lately how democracy is in retreat. And we know it didn't happen overnight. So talk to us a little bit about how we got here and what you think philanthropy can do to help stop this democratic decline.
Well, it's been a steady one over the last couple of decades, and it sort of crept up on us unnoticed. I think we all were motoring on a euphoria of post-Cold War collapse and the rapid spread of democracy. It had started in post-colonial Africa and other regions, but really picked up pace as the Soviet Empire collapsed. And we've just been very slow to pivot to recognize that far from being on the offensive, democracy is now on its back foot, that we've seen in Freedom House's annual reports on the state of democracy, steady declines notched up over much of the world over the last 15 years or so. And, you know, I just think we've not adjusted policies or taken stock of where we are in a way which says this is a real crisis for freedom for people everywhere, and we need to sort of stand up to it and get organized to confront it.
Well, as we speak, as you know, the Biden administration is convening this summit for democracy. And naturally, rallying the world's democracies is a good kind of organizing or convening principle. But what do you think is missing here in this effort to actually strengthen democracy around the world on the ground?
Well, it is on the ground that ultimately the battle for democracy is won or lost. It's more often than not street demonstrators risking their lives to fight for the preservation or the establishment of democracy in their countries. And in the past, the most successful US role was not imposing democracy, but it was, forcing governments to at least respect the right of their citizens and allow those demonstrations to continue and allow people power on the ground usually to determine the outcome. And in recent years, we've just seen governments no longer listening to that pressure from the US or others. That is both because of the sort of rising confidence and rising number of authoritarian and populist governments in the world, but it's also the weakness of the West. A US which has sort of lost its global leadership role in recent years, and a Europe not able to step in and fill the breach. And so, we've got this terrible vacuum around democracy, people still yearning for it, seeking it in many countries, but without the sort of backup from outside that used to enable democracy to both establish itself, be protected, and preserved.
Yeah, I want to talk about the connection now between COVID and the democracy crisis that many countries are facing. And I know you're very involved in vaccine equity. How does that play into it?
I think it's absolutely key because it is the coming crisis of, if you like, injustice in the world. And it's not one which is sort of, mitigated at this stage by just getting some more vaccine distribution, vital though that is. It's spoken to an unjust system where in the developed world, most of us have now had our second, and certainly in many cases, me, certainly my third shot. And yet, many people in the developing world, in Africa, less than 7% of the population is vaccinated, a much smaller portion of that with 2 shots. And so this inequality has allowed new strains to take hold in southern Africa, which now threaten all of us. So it's an issue of global health security, but it's above all a political and moral issue because if we allow this to continue, we'll sort of create a strange health apartheid in the world where there's half the world where international travel will resume, we can trade with each other, and half the world that we're going to hold at arm's length for fear of the import of further variants, and where economics will slow, the sense of political grievance about exclusion from the sort of vaccine access of the North is going to sort of inflame further an already very divided world politics. So, a lot riding on the world rising to the occasion. And, it's worth saying that the Biden administration has offered some late leadership, but even now, nothing like the scale that's needed given the scale of the crisis. Biden's surrounded by people who've worked on Ebola and other regional health crises in the past, even at the drama of HIV/AIDS at the turn of the century. But nobody's seen this kind of all-enveloping, persistent global epidemic. And you have to go back to 1918 for its equivalent, Spanish flu. And, we simply are not rising to the occasion with sufficient imagination or political will.
Yeah, as we close, Mark, I mean, and you make such an important point about, the new kind of definition of poverty is going to be whether you have a vaccine or not. And you've been in the trenches for decades, Open Society Foundation, George Soros, supporting democratic movements for more than 30 years. How important is this moment and ending the pandemic to shoring up democracy around the world?
It's the key moment. It's a key moment where we can either start turning around the battle for democracy, we can notch up a real win by showing that there is equity and justice and solidarity in the world, that we've risen as a global community to the challenge. And if we do that, then I think that same spirit of collaboration can let us tackle other problems together. And one thing which is beyond doubt is democracies work much better with each other than authoritarian governments, particularly around the sort of principles of collaboration and burden sharing and justice in international affairs. So we need a big win to turn this anti-democratic tide. And if we win over COVID, that could be the turning point. If we lose, it will make the tide come a lot further in before we find another turning point.
Well, it's a dire warning, and we know democracy is a continuous journey, and we have to keep focused on strengthening, protecting those ingredients of democracy to prevent further erosion. And philanthropy has such an important part to play, particularly in ending the pandemic. Mark Malloch-Brown, president of Open Society Foundations. Great to see you again. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, Elise.
We'll send it back now to the Washington Post.
Welcome back. For those just joining, I'm David Ignatius, foreign affairs columnist for the Washington Post. My next guests in our discussion today of threats to democracy at home and abroad are former ambassador to Russia, Michael McFaul, and former director of the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency at the Department of Homeland Security. That's a mouthful, Chris Krebs. Michael and Chris, welcome.
Thanks for having us.
Hey, David, good to see you.
So, Chris, let me lead off with you. You got sacked last year in the last months of the Trump administration, basically for trying to protect our elections and speaking out clearly and directly about threats to them. I want to ask you how you would gauge threats to elections at home and abroad, in particular in your area of specialization, cybersecurity, but more generally, what would be your report card as of right now, December 2021?
Well, I think I'm probably most or best situated to talk about the domestic elections landscape. And I think the unfortunate reality is that we've probably, we're backsliding from an elections administration perspective. And it's not due to the professional election officials, the real heroes of the 2020 election. It's because of political interference at the state level in federal elections. And specifically, you look at Arizona, you look at Georgia, you look at a few of the other states that were pivotal in the decision of the 2020 election. Last year, you're seeing political operatives, hacks that have no election experience, instead, bend the knee to the former president, that are looking to take over Secretary of State roles. Mark Finchem in Arizona and Jody Hice in Georgia, they're running for those roles. I have serious concerns that if they are in the Secretary of State role, certifying elections in 22 and 24, that we may not have the Brad Raffenspergers and Katie Hobbs that actually uphold or upheld their constitutional duties the next time around. And in fact, we may have a different outcome with the, once again, political interference at that state level.
Chris, a brief follow-up. Democrats in Congress argue that the situation is so serious in terms of threats to elections, election integrity and outcomes, that we need new legislation to protect our elections. Do you think they're right?
Don't just listen to Democrats in Congress. Look at Ben Ginsburg, a Republican election lawyer, wrote an op-ed in the National Review Online a couple of weeks ago, talked about how we need to, update and amend the Electoral Count Act and clarify the role of the vice president. We need to clarify who the state executive is, whether Secretary of State or the governors in certifying state elections, what it means when you have contesting a state's results, and perhaps raising the threshold beyond just one congressperson that can object to a state's electoral slate. I think we need clarity in elections because, if anything, operatives domestic and abroad have determined that there's ambiguity and that they can sit in the unclear gray space and create havoc and undermine confidence in our public institutions.
So you would support some sort of legislative attempt to clarify, including Ben Ginsburg's proposal, and I assume some other things you think need to be addressed.
I think yes, yes, and I would probably also throw into that bucket, requirements for independent state bodies that can review redistricting maps. I think that's going to be one of the key pivotal areas that can be once again pointed to for influencing future elections for the next 10 years.
So, Michael, let me turn to you. We have just had President Biden's summit for democracies. I'd be interested in your assessment of what that achieved and what it didn't. And I also want to ask you about yesterday's response from President Xi Jinping and Russian President Vladimir Putin with their own virtual counter summit. I'm tempted to call it the Dictators Club. But what did you make of their response, and also give us your assessment of how you think the summit that President Biden hosted went?
Well, first, I think it was a great idea that he had the summit, right? So the counterfactual is some people said it was inappropriate to have this summit. I disagree with that. It brought attention to it. Look at David, you and I are talking about it right now. We wouldn't have been talking about democracy. We might not be having this session without that summit, right? So I think that's maybe a small bar to get over, but that was important. Second, I do think that the administration did pledge to do some new things on a variety of issues, supporting independent media, fighting corruption, and USAID in particular. Isobel and Samantha Power and their team, I think, put together a rather impressive package. It was modest from my view, in terms of the numbers, but they're obviously trying to push and do something to renew our commitment to support democracy abroad. What I thought was underdeveloped is exactly what you're just talking about with Chris. The most important thing we can do to advance democracy abroad is to advance democracy at home. If you are worried about China's growing power in the world and the new Cold War 2.0, as many people in Washington are, and lots of people out here at Stanford and Hoover, by the way, are, the most important thing we can do is exactly what you and Chris were just talking about. That is way more important than a $5 million program to support investigative journalism. And I just would have liked to have seen more of that, our pledging what we're going to do to be part of that bigger conversation. But better than not having it. And now we have a year of action, and I think that's appropriate, and I hope there will be a year of action. Now, there's already been some reaction, like you said, like I call it the illiberal international, just so you know, David, that's my term. Remember, communists of the world unite. This is illiberals of the world unite. And I do think they have, by the way. I think there's been lots more coordination between the autocrats of the world. Mr. Putin is running a very sophisticated game plan for decades now. It started with the Orange Revolution in 2004, where he is putting massive resources into propaganda, into media, into cyber, as Chris well knows, to undermine democracy and to support his ideology. And I'm using that word purposely because I think there's too many people in the world and too many people in Washington who don't look at the ideological content of what Mr. Putin is doing. It is an ideological struggle. He has a set of views, a kind of conservative, illiberal, orthodoxy, anti-multilateralism. He's been very consistent on it. I've followed him for years and sat in the room when he explained it to people like President Biden and then Vice President, now President Biden, and President Obama. And he's had some successes. Let's be clear. There are major movements in most of the European democratic world that lean towards Putin instead of liberal democracies and President Biden. And yesterday, Xi Jinping has been more careful. He has a different ideology. It's an anti-democratic ideology. It's a much more successful system than the Russian system has to offer right now. But they are united in their response to the liberal democratic world. And yesterday was a pretty, powerful response to say, yes, we understand this is an ideological competition, and we are ideologically aligned in this competition.
Just a brief follow-up, Michael. Do you think that we're making them nervous by stressing democracy?
They would be nervous whether you stressed it or not. And it's a great question. And I'm writing a book right now about lessons from the Cold War for how to deal with China and Russia. And I think this is a really important lesson. It doesn't matter, David, you and I could sit out here at Stanford and, in the faculty lounge and say, it would be better if we were just more realpolitik about, what we're going to do abroad and not talk about democracy and just forget about it. And I want to be clear, we need to manage this ideological contest in ways that we did not manage it in the Cold War that led to travesty. Many of the lessons from the Cold War are ones not to be repeated, in my view. But even if we said that, it doesn't matter for two reasons. One, the very existence of our system of democracy threatens the legitimacy of Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin and every other autocrat in the world. So it doesn't matter what we say and do, it's what we practice that matters. And when we don't practice democracy well, that strengthens their legitimacy. And that's the key point between domestic politics and international politics. Conversely, and this is something I think we need to be honest about too, the very existence of an effective economic model, autocratic economic model, threatens the United States. And it's when it's combined with power, as it is in the case of China, that threatens the United States. And no amount of talking about not having ideology involved in U.S.-China and U.S.-Russian relations will diminish that. That's the first point. The second point is whether it's a good thing or a bad thing. I'm agnostic. I think it's a good thing myself, but it is a thing, which is even if President Biden got up one night and said, I want to be more like Nixon, or I want to be more like Metternich. I don't want to talk about all this ideology, although Metternich actually was a big suppressor of liberal democratic movements. So let's not go back that far. I don't want to talk about this. This summit of democracies, let's pull it down. What if he had said that? Well, as you know well, President Biden's not the only foreign policy decision maker in the United States. And if he did that, and if he said, we're no longer going to have morals, we're not going to have normative issues in American foreign policy, there's all kinds of parts of our political system that would challenge him on that. Senator Cruz would challenge him. Senator Rubio would challenge him. The Washington Post would challenge him. Thinking of our friend Fred Hyatt, who recently passed away, the op-ed page of the Washington Post would challenge him. On China, Speaker Pelosi would challenge him. Human rights groups would challenge him. Religious groups would challenge him. In other words, you can't, as Henry Kissinger once said famously, you can't be Metternich in the American political system because you don't have the same control over making policy. We are a democratic system, and therefore I think it's it's part of who we are. As you said in an earlier interview, it goes all the way back to the founding of our republic. And when we were faced with, do we support our allies, the French monarchy, or those that are ideologically aligned with us during the French Revolution, that's when that debate really started. And it's been with us for 230 years, and I don't think it'll go away.
Thank you for that, Michael. I look forward to the book. We'll have you back to talk about it when it's done. I hope. So, Chris, let me ask you. You're a technologist, understand cybersecurity. One of the paradoxes of our age is that this wonderful gift of the wide open internet has turned out to help autocrats stabilize their countries, suppress freedoms, and it's produced greater disorder in democracies. It was supposed to work the other way around. Just wondering if you, as you think about it, see any ways to address that gross imbalance that it empowers the bad guys and seems to harm the good guys. How do we deal with that?
Well, when I think about technology, it's inherently dumb, right? It's not good, it's not evil, it's how people use it. And this is frankly kind of always been the case in human history, starting with common languages, and as you move through technology with the radio, the mimeograph, TV, facsimile, fax machines, and now you've got the internet. And that's, I think, what's so remarkable is just the velocity of information, the access of information. And if you think to the dichotomy between the illiberal orders and the liberal democracies, in liberal democracies, it's a bottom-up feature where information is shared and that we have a framework of engaging across the internet. And in illiberal orders, autocracies, dictatorships, it's a top-down regime where they control the information. And that's I think, when you think about an information operation, an influence operation, where a Chinese government operative or Russian government operative might sneak an ad into the New York Times or the Washington Post full-page ad talking about how great they are, they see that as a huge success, because if the flip were, the inverse were to happen, where there would be a single positive statement about democracy in some periodical in China or Russia, that would be a massive travesty, and they would memory hold that, just like the Chinese government does time and time again. So in terms of opening these back up, I think it's in part an isolation effect. We continue to we have to continue to show the advantages of open information, societies like we have here in the U.S. and other liberal democracies, and how that leads to further innovation, that we can continue to drive the future of the human growth. The flip side, though, has a much darker, a much more limited space of opportunity around it, and continue to, through the cracks and seams that are available in Russia and China and their government systems, let the thousand flowers bloom here and let them show what the opportunities we have are.
Chris, a quick follow-up. You were responsible for cybersecurity in the Trump administration, sometimes a frustrating job. How do you think the Biden administration is doing on that front? They've got a lot of new positions and people. How are they doing?
They are, brimming with talent. It's really remarkable, the team they've been able to put together throughout the various departments and agencies. I couldn't be more proud of the agency that I had the honor to lead, the Cyber and Infrastructure Security Agency. Jen Easterly is just doing a remarkable job there. And under incredibly trying circumstances, right now we're sitting in the middle of a kind of a 5-alarm fire across the internet with a very ubiquitous open source vulnerability that IT teams across the world are patching. And one of the interesting trade-offs that we have to make is that there are other things going on in the world right now. I would look squarely at the Russian soldiers amassing on the Ukrainian border, those geopolitical tensions there, the increased tension between China and Taiwan. If those things escalate further, it will not just be little green men and tanks rolling across the border. There will be digital operations that accompany any sort of first movement. And so there's a significant amount of planning and preparation happening that should be happening here in the US and in our allied countries to support Ukraine and some of the other areas of operation that may be affected. So they're doing a fantastic job. The cards are stacked against them, but I think given all of that, they're making progress.
Thank you for that. I just want to note for our audience, consistent theme of our discussion of democracy has been bipartisanship, that these are issues that Republicans and Democrats share a common perspective. Here's Chris Krebs, who worked for President Trump, lauding the work done by successors in a Democratic administration. Michael McFaul, I want to ask you about the issue that Chris raised. You could argue the most immediate, visceral threat to democracy is 100,000 Russian troops along the Ukraine border who appear to be preparing for a possible invasion of Ukraine. Vladimir Putin as well as any former ambassador. You've watched him close up. You've been tongue lashed by him. Let me ask you what judgment you'd make about what he's going to do. Is he bluffing? Is he going to go over that line? Is there a way to finesse his demand for some sort of guarantees for Russia's security without doing something that we'll regret for decades?
I don't know, David, and nobody else knows. That's the first thing I want to say. I do know Putin pretty well. I first met him in 1991, so we go way back, and I dealt with him in the government. I've written about him. And the other thing I know is that Vladimir Putin likes ambiguity. He likes uncertainty. He's very comfortable in this moment right now. Whereas Americans were not very comfortable with uncertainty and ambiguity. That was a very stark lesson I learned working in the government. I was in the government for 5 years with Obama, President Obama's administration. You know, we're kind of engineers, David. You know, if there's a problem out there in the world, we want to fix it and we want to get in there with gusto and find a solution. Vladimir Putin's very comfortable with ambiguity about sovereignty, about wins. And very vividly, I remember, you know, right before I left in 2014 from Moscow, actually the day that Putin invaded Ukraine was the day I ended my tenure as ambassador. And in the run up to that, to remind your listeners and viewers, you know, we were in a contest over whether Mr. Yanukovych, the president of Ukraine, would sign up with the European Economic Union, Eurasian Economic Union that Putin was pushing versus the European Union. And in that initial battle, the Russians won. They gave him more money. And I saw a very senior Russian government official around that time. And he said, Mike, here's your problem, you Americans. He was speaking about the West. He said, number one, we care more about Ukraine than you do. And number two, you guys have short time, attention spans. So, you know, we'll be here forever. You'll forget about us and time will move on. And I think about that quote because here we are now. We're not talking about Abkhazia. We're not talking about South Ossetia. We're not talking about Crimea. All those are parts that we don't talk about. We're talking about the new invasion, the new guarantees we have to make to Putin. And already because of that, I would say that's a major victory for Vladimir Putin. That he's pocketed those victories. That's part of the past. And nobody's talking about those interventions and those violations of sovereignty before. And number two, he likes the fact that he so far he's given nothing. He's indicated no concessions. And we're now talking about concessions, right? So just, I think from his point of view and the proposals that are now going to be talked about even today and tomorrow, that's already a second victory. The third victory we have to avoid is things that we will live to regret, as you just said. And I actually feel pretty good about where President Biden is so far. I thought the meeting he had, it's always good to meet with leaders, even adversaries. I firmly agree with that. But it was also important, the messaging that he said otherwise. We actually don't know what they really said in that meeting. Let's be clear about that. I wrote many of those readouts when I worked for President Obama, and they're not exactly, every word was exactly what happened in the meetings. We left some things out from time to time. You wouldn't be surprised. So, and the Russian readout, by the way, was quite different than the American readout. But the main message that President Biden delivered was there will be real consequences of military intervention. And I think that was the appropriate thing to do then. The devil will be now in the details if there will be continued negotiations. And to oversimplify, Vladimir Putin wants a Yalta 2.0. He wants to sit with Biden. He actually doesn't want the Brits there anymore, but he wants to sit down with Biden and carve out a sphere of influence, a new sphere of influence for Russia, and agree to the rules of the road for European security. That would be a horrendous mistake to agree to that, both in substance and form. In form, we should want a Helsinki 2.0, which is that, yeah, let's talk about European security. I think that's appropriate. And there's been a lot of erosions of those institutions over the last several years and decades. And some of that was on our side. I want to be clear. You know, the INF treaty recently, the Trump administration walked away from. That was, in my view, a mistake. And that we don't have that in place is not good. The CFE treaty is more or less moribund. So I think a big conversation about new European security issues and maybe even some new norms, and probably treaties are too hard in America anymore, but a big conversation. But it's got to be with Ukrainians in the room, not the Ukrainians be the subject of those negotiations. And that I'm not sure Vladimir Putin will agree to.
Super helpful answer, folks. That's as good an account as you can get of big problems affecting us from two of the smartest people that I know. Ambassador Michael McFaul, former Assistant Director Chris Krebs. Thank you so much for joining us for this discussion of threats to democracy.
Thanks for having
Thanks,
us.
David.
So please check out all the programming we've got coming in the future. Go to WashingtonPostLive.com, register for the programs that interest you. Thank you for joining us today for this special hour-long discussion of threats to democracy. We'll see you soon.